Welcome to the People's Forum.
Recoupment. Recoupment of our birthright would come from interest over the years of oppression and exploitation. We're demanding recoupment of earnings that were never paid. The initial demand of this recoupment is, as a start, $6 billion. $6 billion for the creation of a black urban coalition.
Welcome back, ADOS family. We're getting ready to get into the incarceration or the criminalization of the ADOS population that was done from the end of Reconstruction straight through to right now today. How do you guys feel about that? View somebody?
I mean, this country was built initially on slavery. They outlawed slavery, and the only means in which slavery can be legal in America is through incarceration. So it seems like their goal and their objective is to, pretty much jail us.
But it only took 2 years for them to come up with that. It's taken us 150 years to have the discussion about getting paid back for all work extracted from us with no compensation. But it takes them 2 years to decide another way to get us back into a situation where we work for nothing or, virtually nothing.
I mean, what does that say? All right, so the history of this country and it's dealing with us, what is it telling us?
It tells us that we have to stay resolute, that they didn't want to free us, and somehow that happened. That no one wanted us to vote, but somehow that happened.
Well, that was also not really about us.
But it happened. We're talking about it just happened.
Right, it happened, but it happened because they had a stake in the game.
Exactly.
They freed us, but then you had all these people laying around, and that threw out the 3/5 rule, which meant that the South...
The 3/5 rule, they figured that the South had a population that were going to allow them to outvote them and rule them and everything. So they had to, number one, bring that number down. And the second way they brought it down was to start putting people in prison. I mean, what do we have, 4 million people?
Prison is a modern control, but if we're talking about the time of the 13th and 14th Amendment, there was Ku Klux Klan, there was the sharecropping, which is just continued slavery.
Exactly.
But the 13th Amendment, when they freed slaves, they had nothing to do with them. 14th, you had to give them the right to vote, because if they didn't, the South would have voted us probably back into another civil war. So there was a reason to give African Americans a reason to vote, that even if you didn't want them, you needed them. So the question, if we talk about reparations or even overhauling the criminal justice system, if there's no stake in for them, something for them, it's a short conversation.
So what happens to an obsolete labor class when they no longer need you as a labor class? What happens to 44 million ADOS? Because they don't need you as a labor class anymore. That's done.
And it's getting worse.
So what happens? Give me an answer. What happens to 44 million people?
Well, jail cells.
We start building private prisons.
Bingo.
Private prisons are the answer.
I mean, that's what's happening, or the conversion. I don't want to get into the conspiracy theories or the conversion of a lot of these big box stores, but like I said, the powers that be have made America a place where, our policies and our ability to make it in life, in comparison to other countries, or other people, there's such a huge gap that when we complain, it's almost as if we are ingrates. especially if they say, well, look at life outside of America. And if you think it's so bad here, then go to Africa. Well, part of the policies here in America is the reason why Africa is in the toilet, or other quote-unquote third world nations.
Because the wealth was being extracted and sent back to America and Europe, and they're benefiting. Their currencies are backed by African resources. The economies are upheld by African resources, and Africa doesn't have roads. They barely have schools. They have failing militaries. They have failing everything. But all of the resources are going someplace else and building things up where people have 8 weeks off and 16 weeks of maternity leave and free school and free health care and all of these wonderful things, but they don't have any resources because it's been extracted from another group that people want to ignore and act like they're not here. You know what? I'm not a praying per se person, but I would like to say thank the Creator, thank the Most High, thank energy, thank somebody that somebody finally is starting to acquiesce and at least make some verbal admissions. Belgium, as recently as last night, I don't know when this came out, but I read it last night, made a public verbal apology for kidnapping and mutilating Central African people.
I mean, thank you. Like I said, I just think my mindset is it's obvious to me. I remember recently, and just from my side of the industry, Wall Street finance, I was going through a site that every single day it lists financial institutions, money raises, regardless whether it's REITs, whether it's big institutions, it doesn't matter. But every single day, whatever financial transactions that were submitted to the SEC, basically it's listed on this website, Forms D. And I started looking at Forms D every single day, just, interesting, taking a look at what companies were raising money. There's a company very similar to Chipotle by the name of Roti. I looked at their funding. I'm like, wow, this is interesting. But one thing I did notice is that every single day, trillions of dollars are raised and we're not involved. And this has been going on for 200 years. So that gap and the way everything is set up, it is clear and obvious that we are the fodder, we are the grounded meat, and we can continue having this debate and discussion as long as we want, but until we create an agenda that has some teeth that could truly get their attention, all we'll be doing.
I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a question because we keep talking about teeth and agendas and voting. In South Africa, to use them as a another model for apartheid, as they called it, Jim Crow as we called it.
Right.
Okay, there are roughly 44, 50 million South Africans, of which the Boas, the European South Africans, are less than, I believe it was 7% or 11% of the country. They have control of every aspect of government. They still cannot get the land and the wealth back. If you don't have the land and the wealth, you will be criminalized. Right here in America, we're 7 times more likely to be murdered. We're 3.5 more times likely to be sexually assaulted, and 12 times more likely to be a victim of a drug crime or mandatory minimums. I mean, come on, it's crazy.
But the thing about it is, we're not gonna establish any real change just by kumbayaing.
Okay, so now that you put that out there, and there's an elephant in the room, so I'm going to speak to it. Okay, since we don't have an army, black men are not trained militarily, they're not trained academically. How do you fight if you have no army, you have no land, you have no money, you have no resources?
You choke them out.
Fight?
You choke them out financially.
But you gotta have a seat at the table where the finances are being done, and we don't have a seat, much less in the room.
We do have a seat because we have a dollar.
If you don't have a supermarket, if they decided to say no black people in the supermarket, we would starve.
No, and the supermarket go out of business.
Only in select neighborhoods.
Only in select neighborhoods. Only in your neighborhood, where there's generally a food desert to begin with.
No, because from a population standpoint, we're the spoon that stirs the drink. We are that excess capital that's required for capitalism to move forward. Rich people are not spending to the volume of the size of the poor population.
They don't have to. They create a situation as you, the consumer, like these islands that,
But
that
they don't
we all
dictate
love.
the economy,
Those
we
islands
do.
are just consumers for us. They lock
They
our
only
people
benefit from they only benefit. They don't dictate it. Like those 3,000 billionaires, they just can't perpetually move the economy. You need the other 300 million people to spend their $10 every.
And you're
We
right,
have
but someone needs to
gatekeepers.
tell them that because their policies don't make it an open market where they would benefit. It seems like they're working against their best interest economically with the way they run the economy.
No, I think that they are enriching themselves beyond belief, and they're spreading the gap. And basically,
They are, but they're not creating more consumers.
Well, then, like I said, a whole nother topic because, you know, I believe that, quote unquote, the traditional consumer is nothing more than fodder to them. If we live or die, at the end of the day, as long as they make money off of our life and death process, it doesn't matter.
So if there are new consumers that are coming into the country daily,
They're going to spend. They don't have to encourage the consumer to consume. It's a habit. We're going to do it. That's why I say the only way to show teeth is to pull back your dollar. Simple. I mean, now, I don't know if we'll be able to. I don't know if. And I really like I said, I recently became intimate with the Birmingham boycotts, the Alabama. Recently, I would say, when I say recently, like digging into it, probably 10 years ago, where 10 years ago I was blown away that this boycott lasted almost 2 years and almost bankrupted the state of Alabama. Mm-hmm. And it blew me away. But all they had to do was like say, I'm sorry, mm-hmm. and then we got back on the bus and now Alabama, it's still the same. I believe that is the only way that we're going to be able to get anyone's attention is by pulling back our dollar.
If I said that in my top 5 of states that have criminalized and incarcerated our people, Alabama is probably somewhere around number 4 or 5.
Mississippi, South Carolina,
South Carolina, Louisiana. I mean, they have people in prisons working for 10 cents an hour.
Oh yeah, listen, I'm not debating what they've done, and I'm not debating how intense this level of racism is, especially with individuals that are incarcerated. I mean, like I said, we know everything. We know the truth. There's nothing else for us to discover.
But if you can't march your way out and you can't pray your way out, I think some people have decided to integrate their way out, and we know that doesn't work.
I just think that we need to.
Your point of holding back the dollar, do you realize that for a large segment of our neighborhoods, they don't have discretionary spending? The money they spend are things that are absolutely necessary to feed, to pay the rent, to keep them going. Mm-hmm. So they can't really pull that money back. All they can do is maybe channel that money to African-American businesses, and there's not a lot of those. So when you're talking about pull the money back, for a lot of people, it's just not an option. Yeah. For us,
where do we spend it,
might have that option, but for a lot of the people I grew up with in the neighborhoods I grew up with, they're barely making it. They're going to spend.
Listen, there's a difficult, like I said, but that's part of this infrastructure that we're talking about.
But how do we build that? We don't have any money.
Listen, I think that I have a glass ceiling as far as being able to intellectually come up with that plan. I support the person that does, but I do know that it's needed. And I think, like I said, this discussion right here, we've had this discussion before, whether it was just tradition, just driving in a car, it's just, getting together after frat events. We've had this discussion before. We all have talked about these points. Every single melanated person on this planet has talked about the same things now. What are we going to do moving forward? And like I said, if we don't withhold our dollar, I mean, we don't want it to result in anything warlike.
Atiba, let me give Jason the last 30 seconds before the break, and then we'll come back and we'll beat this up some more.
Earlier before, we were talking about the amendment, and I just can't get it out of my mind, the 14th Amendment. Mm-hmm. Because you can't talk about the 14th Amendment without talking about the 4th. Exactly. And especially us being policemen, we realize that when we talk about people being incarcerated, they're incarcerated.
I want to cut you here.
Right,
when we come back, we're going to deal with 4th Amendment, 13th Amendment, and 14th Amendment, and then I'll introduce you to Albert Woodcox, a man who spent 43 years in solitary confinement.
gypsy. Hang with a gypsy girl.
Okay, we had a heated discussion going on. We're going to pick it right back up. I finished with Albert Woodcox. He did 43 years in Angola. Angola's the worst prison in Louisiana. Louisiana, I don't care what they say. I've been to New Orleans. I've been to a couple of different places, Baton Rouge. That is one big plantation. Go ahead, baby.
Picking up on what, Angola?
No, picking up on incarceration, picking up on an answer.
Well, I don't know if I have an answer. I have talking points I want to learn to educate people and talk about. And what we were talking about a minute ago was the difference between the 4th and the 14th Amendment. And this sounds like it's not that important, but it's huge. As policemen, we understand the difference because when we're talking about how to eradicate differential behavior or racism, we're not going to do it using the courts because the courts only really consider the 4th Amendment. And that's all about, did you follow the laws, did you probable cause, reasonable suspicion? The action should be at the 14th Amendment. And that predates the 4th Amendment. The question of fairness, why did it? Someone got a summons. Right. No, not even bigger. Something as simple as the summons. When you get to court, they ask you, did you break the law? Did you run the light? Whatever the traffic thing is. But they won't ask the officer, how did he notice that? Did he follow you because you were black and eventually you did something? Because we enforce just the 4th and the 14th is equally important, but don't enforce that, we need to change our criminal justice system and the laws. Even if you think about...
But how do we change that? We don't have the judges, we don't have the politicians, we don't have the voting.
Well, that conversation is also happening now. In the federal government, they're talking about how to overhaul some of these laws and changing the criminal justice system. Even someone who I dislike as much as Trump is trying to pretend to have that conversation. So just like the conversation about apartheid, it's moving beyond that, where now we'll be visiting voting rights for people who've been incarcerated, like they just did in L.A., where you've been incarcerated, you did some time, you've been freed, you paid your debt, but still weren't allowed to vote. Those days look like they're going away. And it's like the criminal justice system is weird. It takes slow steps at a time. You mentioned Louisiana, which used to have the highest number of incarcerated people simply for violating parole and probation. They've got broke doing that. They can't afford to do it. So again, something in it for them. They're thinking about maybe we need to do something else. So we're beginning to take a look at the criminal justice system.
They furloughed them and they put exorbitant amounts of restitution. See, we understand restitution when we're putting it on us. Every day, black men and women, ADOS people are forced to pay restitution. They don't have jobs, they don't have training, they don't have homes. But when you leave that courthouse, there's an order for restitution. If you don't pay the restitution, they reincarcerate you. So how come they know about restitution in that case when we're the ones paying the restitution? But when it's supposed to come back the other way, for the work of the 10 generations of free work, nobody knows how it can work. Nobody knows how to do it.
Well, that's because they view them as separate conversations. You don't hear any conversation about reparations in the criminal justice system. Those are two separate conversations, and they're not linked yet. I think at time they might be.
At the end of the day, these are citizens. At the end of the day, they're citizens, and if they can pay restitution, then they can get reparations because they're paying restitutions to restore their quote-unquote victims back to the state that they were before the crime.
In some areas, but that's another change that we got to do. Actually, victims get a very short riff in our criminal justice system. It's all about until they testify. The minute they're done testifying, we have almost no use for them.
Exactly.
There's no phone calls, how you doing, how do we fix your life? So even when you're talking about that, victims, that's got to be another whole conversation, especially since a lot of the victims are us. So the criminal justice system really doesn't do a good job of victims. You know, once you've gone through the system and you've made it so that person can be incarcerated, not rehabilitated, that's the end of the conversation.
Atiba, if I told you the likelihood of going to prison and broke it down along racial lines, white men were 1 in 17 white men would end up incarcerated in their lifetime. 1 in 3 for black men. For Latinos, 1 in 6. For women, it's 1 in 56. For white women, 1 in 111. But again, once you come to black women, it's 1 in 18. Why do we lead in all of these horrific categories? I mean, something is. I always say, and it was always a rule of thought, that if all roads point to a conclusion, and you keep looking the other way, then either you are inept or unqualified,
or insane.
Or insane.
I mean, once again, it's clear and it's obvious what the United States, what the government of the United States, and how they believe and how they deal towards melanated people in America. It's clear and obvious. It's just a matter of us dealing with this abuse. I feel, you know that scenario when they talk about abuse, that syndrome where the victim...
Stockholm?
Stockholm, that's exactly. Where the victim is constantly...
in love with their captor.
And you know, and in love and or trying to appease them. I feel like in our quest for reparations, we're basically saying, please hand us the money from what you've done to us, and I don't see it happening. Now, the solution, I don't know, but I believe that we are dealing with a firm implementation of this evil system. It's firm.
For 1 second, I just want us to get away from ourselves as, because we are, I guess, in the top 5% of our population. Let's think about that. Those people who are at the 95, who are at the bottom. Let's think about the people who went to high school with that didn't make it out of high school, that didn't make it out of junior high school. Let's think about the kids who had, you know, their parents didn't bring any drugs into this country. You know, father never produced any bathroom gin, much less any Mad Dog 2020. But whatever the things, the substances, and the situations are that broke down their families and broke them down, they never received the opportunity, and thusly their children are not receiving opportunities. You know, your children
we have
in
to
college.
do something. We have to do
my children in college.
We have to do miracle work. Like, you know, like I'm a child of what drugs has done in America and how it was geared towards our community. Like, I'm like a statistic. Me and my siblings, and we say it all the time. Like, you know, guys, we weren't supposed to be here. And it takes an extraordinary, you know, amount of dig deep to get out of it. You know, it was rough, but we're totally capable of doing it. And once we get to where we're at right now, or where I am at right now, where we're at right now, I think it's such a serious road that we have to be 10 times intense of implementing exactly what we want. And what's needed, and be prepared to go the extent to get it. And I think that we have, I think we've yielded at times. Sometimes that pressure coming from the government, it's intense. It's very intense, and it's, you know, lives were lost, and careers and reputations were destroyed.
They will snatch you off the street, put you into a dog cage, and close the door and turn off the light.
Yeah, and the problem is that
they'll use
once
the
that
law
happens
to do it.
And once that happens, we don't go and defend that person to the end.
I'm glad you said that. There's a young man who got life in prison from Brooklyn. He got life in prison. Now, I don't know a lot of statistics about the case, but one thing I can say is if you are unable to assist in your defense or unable to recognize the crime or that you're not supposed to be standing trial. You know, this man with a public defender facing Kings County District Attorney's Office had a mistrial, you know, by the grace of the Most High, and then all of a sudden, was convicted, life without parole, goodbye, mother crying in a black dress, riding up to Elmira or Dannemora or Green or any of the other facilities.
That was that. I'll listen. I have a very interesting relationship with that case. This is the most recent case.
Chanel.
I would say at least 2 to 3 of my really good friends that I've had relationships with for 30 years, were his former teachers. And they taught it, I think it's called LaSalle Academy. I forgot, not LaSalle Academy, DePore de Martis. I forgot the name of the school, but it caters towards kids with learning disabilities and things of that nature. And they can vouch for his personality. Like I said, a dear friend, known him 30 years. And he said he's as meager as a mouse.
Had he been the violent individual that he was portrayed to be, he would have had a track record throughout high school because he would have constantly been going through that system.
Meager as a mouse.
A day after his conviction, the entire confession being led by the district attorney's office was on YouTube. The whole 30 minutes of it.
And you can see
he's just shaking his head because he's a special needs man.
Exactly.
And nobody wanted to say the words.
Yeah.
He's a special needs man, and he was supposed to receive protections and or treatment. And if he's guilty, as I said last show, I harbor no criminals. I harbor no criminals. I take their head off. I'm a strong believer in the death penalty, and I don't have a problem saying it.
I disagree with that. I'm definitely not a
well, because I had 2 brothers that were murdered. So I speak to that. I myself, at 14 years, 15, pardon me, was stabbed in my back and almost killed myself. So I'm an Old Testament kind of brother.
Yeah, but as far as, to that case, I think this, like, I'm prepared to go on record. I think there was something fishy. I think that there was, there just was something that wasn't right about that case. And it's unfortunate. And I was speaking to my friend, and I was telling him, like, you know what, just a group of us, like, the buddies, guys that, we all went to games after, all those teachers that taught at his school.
Atiba,
we need to support him.
We have to wrap up. I'm sorry to cut you off. We're going to bring you back. You guys are both going to be constant fixtures on this show. In the last 10 seconds, all I want to say is what we must have is we must have acknowledgement and admission, just like the Belgians did. Secondly, we must have redress. We need some action to be put in place. And lastly, we have to have closure, and that is in the form of reparations. Good night, America. Thank you very much.
Good night. Good night.